Okay, right off the top, we start with breaking news from the White House. President Donald Trump announcing a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. That ceasefire aimed at trying to pause fighting between Israel and the Iranian-backed group Hezbollah. So let's talk about this live to the White House and CBS News correspondent Natalie Brandt. Natalie, what are the details?
Hi, Reed. Well, the president announced on social media that he spoke to leaders of both Israel and the president of Lebanon this morning, and then that they had agreed to this temporary truce, what the president says will be a 10-day ceasefire starting later tonight at 5 Eastern. He goes on to say that the vice president, secretary of state, and chairman of the Joint Chiefs will work with Israel and Lebanon to try to achieve a lasting peace. And then in a second post shortly after that, he even said that he's inviting both leaders to the White House for the first meaningful talks between Israel and Lebanon in decades, saying that he believes it will happen quickly. We don't have a date or much more information at this point, but this announcement by the president certainly builds on the diplomacy that started earlier this week when diplomats from Israel and Lebanon gathered here in Washington, D.C. with Secretary of State Marco Rubio to begin talking about this. But what's important to note is that Hezbollah was not at the table. So it kind of remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen later this evening. We're still waiting for official statements from Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah. Lebanon's president did confirm that he spoke to President Trump and thanked him for his efforts to work towards a ceasefire here. All of this is also significant, Reed, because remember it was Iran that said that Israel's strikes on Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy in Lebanon, were a violation of the larger ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. And Iran has continued to say that an agreement in Lebanon is important, to these larger negotiations that are still happening behind the scenes.
All right, we'll see if this development shapes the developments yet to come in the days ahead. Natalie Brandt live at the White House. Thank you so much. Well, they have until Tuesday. That's all the time left for the ceasefire between the United States and Iran. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issuing this warning to Iran. Listen.
We are locked and loaded on your critical dual-use infrastructure, on your remaining power generation, and on your energy industry. We'd rather not have to do it, but we're ready to go at the command of our president and at the push of a button. If Iran chooses poorly, then they will have a blockade and bombs dropping on infrastructure, power, and energy.
So let's go live to the CBS News Pentagon reporter Eleanor Watson. Ellie, what are your takeaways from Secretary Hegseth's messaging today?
Well, in the briefing, Secretary Hegseth warned Iran, as you said, that U.S. forces are ready to resume a bombing campaign at a moment's notice if Iran makes the wrong choices during the ceasefire. He said that the blockade that's being enforced right now is the polite way the U.S. is pressuring Iran, but during that ceasefire, the U.S. military is also rearming with more weapons and with more intelligence should the negotiations for a diplomatic deal break down. He also, in that briefing, said that the Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz is not actually control. He called it more piracy and terrorism and said that actually the U.S. Navy is in control of the strait, but he did not explain how the U.S. or how the strait would reopen to normal traffic that was there before the conflict erupted and that would stabilize global energy prices.
Well, we know at the Pentagon briefing earlier today, General Dan Kane laid out how the U.S. military enforces that blockade. Pretty fascinating. Let's listen to this together and then talk about it on the other side.
Let me be clear. This blockade applies to all ships, regardless of nationality, heading into or from Iranian ports. The U.S. action is a blockade of Iran's ports and coastline, not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Enforcement will occur inside Iran's territorial seas and in international waters.
So there you have it. General Kane says that blockade is on all ships heading into or from Iranian ports. Does this reveal anything by way of strategy?
That comment, as well as the graphic that he displayed during the briefing, showed kind of where this blockade is being enforced from. He laid out a map that the warships in the U.S. Navy that are enforcing this are just deep in the Gulf of Oman, and that so far 14 vessels departing from Iranian ports have turned around after reaching that blockade, after communication from U.S. forces directing them to turn around. The U.S. has a bunch of assets down there, 10,000 forces, a dozen warships, and they're flying intelligence flights daily in the Persian Gulf and around the Strait of Hormuz to keep track of what vessels are coming through. Once they get to that net, they can communicate with the vessel and say, hey, turn around, we're enforcing this blockade. And so far, the U.S. has not had to use force to get them to turn around. If it comes to that, there are teams on each of those warships that are trained in boarding, searching, and seizing vessels. And if it needs to go further, there are also helicopters that can board those vessels if necessary.
All right, Ellie Watson following this. Thank you so much. Later tonight, the Daily Report, Setting It Straight, takes a deeper dive into how the war with Iran affects your wallet. That stream drops at 6 p.m. Eastern right here, proudly on CBS News 24/7. We're also following breaking news in Capitol Hill at this hour. An Iran war powers resolution just failed to clear the House. So here's what happened. That bill, by the way, would limit the president's ability to take further military action in Iran without congressional approval. It needed that simple majority. The vote failing 213 to 214. Razor thin margin there. So let's go live to Capitol Hill and CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small. Torian, how are they reacting, first of all, to that small margin, and what else are people saying there?
Yeah, this wasn't really a surprise. I think people were seeing if Democrats would defect from the rest of the party. We saw one ultimately vote with Republicans on this and one Republican voting with Democrats on this. That was Republican Thomas Massie, a libertarian who's had some bouts with President Trump over the past couple of months to years, especially about his handling of the Epstein files, but also especially as it relates to his handling of this conflict with Iran. I think the reason why there is this trepidation among Republicans within that conference to move forward with curbing the president's powers, because as it stands, the president has until May 1st. That's a 60-day mark or deadline to notify Congress about continued actions through the already pre-existing War Powers Act that Congress had passed a while ago. So we heard from Republicans leading up to these war power votes we saw in the Senate yesterday and now today that they want to give the president the runway to accomplish the goals necessary as it relates to this current war within the confines of that 60-day vote or 60-day deadline. Now, what that would look like after that, that would be May 1st. We'll see if any Republicans will be willing to join in Democrats in their calls to curb the president's war powers once that happens, Reed.